Welcome to the Leadership Purpose with Dr. Robin podcast. I'm your host, Robin L. Owens, PhD, and this is where we dive in each week to give advice, tools, and tips for high-achieving, purpose-minded women who've written nonfiction books and want to amplify their message beyond the book. I'm a college professor, and when I'm not doing that, I am speaking, coaching, mentoring, and teaching high-achieving women who have written books how to use their books to make a bigger difference, have more impact, and purpose. Okay, let's dive in. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Leadership Purpose with Dr. Robin podcast. I'm so glad you're here and listening in, especially as we kick off season 2, Beyond the Book. And the kickoff of the season is in the spirit of the summer. And if you're listening at the time of this recording, we are just now at the beginning of summer, and I'm really excited about it. And because of the whole summer feel and theme and vibe, I decided to reread a few books that have had the most impact on me. And one in particular that has left an imprint on my heart and my soul and my way of seeing myself is a book with the title Sparked: Discover Your Unique Imprint for Work That Makes You Come Alive. And this book is by Jonathan Fields. And so that's why I wanted to bring to you an encore of a conversation I had with one of my favorite people, Dr. Kim Middleton, in hopes that it inspires and encourages you to spend some time this summer having conversations with some of your favorite people and or rereading some of the books that made the most impact on you. And I hope you discover your unique imprint for work that makes you come alive, fills you with meaning, joy, purpose, and possibility. Meanwhile, let's join the encore conversation already in progress. She is, like I said, Dr. Kim Middleton, and she's an academic strategist, former English professor, and lifelong educator. But most importantly for this episode, she is my dear friend. And so we're just going to have a conversation. But because she's an academic strategist, we couldn't just have a conversation. I just wanted to have maybe a random conversation, but she had to bring some structure to it. So anyway, welcome, Kim.
Thanks, Rob. I'm just laughing because that actually so beautifully, it's true, right? Where I'm just like, we can't just not have a purpose. So, part of it is that's what's making me laugh. And the other thing that's making me laugh is this is a beautiful manifestation of the thing that we're going to talk about today, right? Which is this book that purports to sort of identify these types that we have and sort of give you a blueprint to who you are and what your best practices are, these kinds of things. And so it's just making me laugh because even how we sort of design this conversation is indicative of those types. I think we might be like an object lesson, essentially, in those types.
So it's working out already.
Truly, he'll be so proud. So yes, Robin is exactly right. I could not imagine just having an actual conversation like a human. I felt like there had to be some topic. So Robin was very kind to indulge me because when I read about this book, I thought, oh, there are all these questions I wanted to ask you about where it intersects with your work because, right? So I should probably tell people what the book is, right?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
We're probably at that moment. Right. So folks, the book that we're talking about is Sparked, Sparked, Discover Your Unique Imprint for Work That Makes You Come Alive. And it's by Jonathan Fields, who's also probably best known for what he calls the Good Life Project, right? It's got a podcast. He's, interacted with all of these people. But what he's done is sort of take all of those interviews that he's done, turn them into what he thinks of as data points in terms of trying to identify these typologies that really get at this blueprint that he talks about, right? He says, I think at some point that he has amassed something like 25 million data points.
Wow.
To really carve out these types. And so I think there's some really interesting overlap with what Robin does. And I think we just thought it would be a fun place to kind of work through some of his ideas. So
yes. And think about our spark types. So, and I'll make sure I'll put the book information in the show notes so you'll have that there. But again, Sparked: Discover Your Unique Imprint for work that makes you come alive, Jonathan Fields. And I'll, again, put it in the show notes. All right. So that frames our conversation because that matches Kim's spark, apparently.
Right. So I should just say, right, one of the things, on the one hand, right, when I think about this book, we have all kinds of different sort of formats in society that sort of purport to tell us who we are, right? I mean, there are those, what's it called? Like the Strengths Finder book, right? This is who you are. The, what is the one, the brain one, like I'm an INTJ, like that.
Oh, the Myers-Briggs,
right? This is who you are. So some might argue that like your horoscope, right? Your astrological sign is just a way of telling you who you are. So that is not to dumb down his book, just to say that he's in that vein. And I think what he's, one of the things that's interesting about the book is that he wants to give you that typology, right? So hopefully you stand up and you kind of wave and you're like, oh yeah, this is me. And it tells me something more about me. I think his addition is to say that you have this sort of primary, as he calls it, sparketype, right? That's his term. And then you have this sort of secondary one that fuels the first one. And then you have this anti one, right? The one that is just a sort of the archetype of actions and tasks that drain you. So in some ways, it's those three different sort of figures and their relationship to each other that I think he's really adding to the discourse.
Yes. And that really gets my attention because I'm very tuned into energy. And I'm always trying to be intentional about what gives me energy and what drains my energy. So this is great. It's really drew me to it. Yeah.
I'm so good. Yes, this is why I had a feeling this was, you were going to be the person to figure out some of this stuff. So we were imagining, is this correct, Robin? Like, rather than me trying to give you a book report, which is already where I am with this book. But the more interesting part would be to unpack our own sparketype, shadow, like secondary sparketypes, anti-one, just so people get a really deep sense of how this book works and what it might add to their understanding.
Well, yeah, I feel like you can give yours. I'll just say how it impacted me. Not even giving what they are, but just the impact of the understanding of my, makerness, which I'll say more about later. But yeah.
Okay, but see, I think you should start.
I think we need a frame about like. You kind of just gave it to us, right? Okay, so I'll tell everybody about my type. And there's a list of types. And mine, it's just called the maker.
Mm-hmm.
The maker. And in a nutshell, makers gotta make. That's how the chapter starts. The chapter starts, makers gotta make. Should we go back and say how we come to these, how we come to know these?
Yeah, I mean, the little that I understand about, I do feel like there's a lot, he is very good at distilling a lot of very complicated data and social science work that they are using. So you can actually go to the Sparketype website. You can take the sort of, what do you call it?
A quiz, maybe? Yeah.
Yeah, and then it will email you which of these you are. Like Robin said, right, he breaks them into these kind of names, personalities, if you will. And I guess over time, they've taken all those data points and they've distilled them into 10 different types, of which one is the maker.
Okay, thank you. All right, so now that we have that, all right. So apparently I'm a maker. I resonated. Kim sent me the link and she said, take it. First, she told me about the book. Check out the book. I ordered the book, took the quiz, and I'm like, wow, this really does describe me. I don't know if I was completely surprised, but in some ways, I was a little bit surprised about the maker. Because at the core of the maker, and he says this directly in his book about the maker, creation is your call. And I'm like, yes, yes, creation is my call. And so you have to kind of go into detail about it, but it basically is about creating and not necessarily building something with your hands. Because when I was talking with someone else, another friend, she said, how are you a maker? You don't even like to put together things, when you buy something new and assembly is required, it makes me scream. I don't literally scream, but that's my reaction to it.
So rude.
So it's not that kind of maker, but it's this idea of this calling, this internal yearning to make and create. And I have that and I love it and it gives me energy. So that's my type. What's your type, Kim?
Yeah. So this is interesting. So mine is the scientist, which for a humanities person is a hard nut to crack, right? Like I'm like, I can't be a scientist because I live over here with the literature people. But it is that, so right, his little slogan for the scientist is like, I figure things out. And it's the call that you're describing for my particular spark type is this like, I just like big, complicated problems, right? I want to just get in there and think about the problem, which is like you say, right? Like even talking about it, I'm like, yes, give it to me. What do you got out there, folks? Like, just give it to me. Like, I just want to like get in there and wrestle with it. So I like that about it because it, like you, Robin, it kind of resonates. It sort of nails something that feels very foundational to my personality and to like my energy, right? Just saying it kind of makes me feel like, yes, I'm energized. I'm like ready to go. But I think I don't want to lose this point that you made because I think it's important, right? It's easy to get hung up on a really traditional understanding of these titles, right? When I think of makers, I think of like dudes in a lab, like, welding things together to make, and that's a very different kind of thing than the thing that you make.
Yes.
But you make things that go out in the world that don't fit that image of what we have. So
yes. And that leads right into what we were talking a little bit about earlier at the beginning about how you and I are representative of each of our types, right? The way we came to this whole podcast episode.
You really should record it.
Right. And so the maker in me, right? The maker in me, the creation that's calling me for this podcast episode, I just wanted to create an experience where you, dear listeners, can listen to a conversation between me and my dear friend. And so that it's about an experience. And for me, I'm creating this. And Kim comes from it, from her type, her perspective.
Yeah, which is right. I do sort of then want to unpack these things, right? Like, so I told Robin in advance, right? Like I have all these questions, right? So, and really I sent her all this stuff about the book because I'm like, I want to know how the way that he's thinking about purpose is related to or differs from the way that Robin thinks about purpose, right? The way that sort of you've spent all of this time really talking to 49 people now about all of the different things that influence that, how to help people think about it, right? So I'm like, that's to me the big question. Like, and even before we had talked about the podcast, I was like, I just want to know what you think about this question. Like, tell me about this question. The other thing though, that is related to what you're talking about, Robin, and maybe this is an entry point too, when he puts out this idea that you have this primary and then you have this secondary, right? So it might feel like that secondary is very strong, but at the end of the day, the secondary just feeds the primary. My secondary one is this archetype he calls the essentialist, which is a weird title for what he means. But the sort of, motivating idea behind the essentialist, right, is I create order from chaos. And I think that was the one that was maybe really engaged when we were talking about like how we're going to do this. Cause I was like, don't hit the record button. Like, I got to know how we're going to do this. What's the format? What's the best format? How do we do it? I was thinking we could put all these things in place, right? Like I want to build a framework so that we can do it. And there's joy in making the framework, right? I love a sort of, I have an idea of always a platonic ideal of a framework that if we just put the right framework in place, the entire world will organize itself beautifully around that framework. So I approach, right, this podcast, my sock drawer, all of it with that same idea, but it's in the service of the bigger question, or this is how he would arrange it, right? So I like that concept. I'd also like to kind of poke at it a little, right? Like, is it as clean and neat as he says? I don't know, but what's your secondary one? Do you remember? Okay.
I don't remember.
Focus on the maker. Maker was what?
I only want to focus on maker. I only want to focus on the maker. Yeah. I don't remember.
Yeah. And it might not be important.
I do remember though, when I read it, it rang true for me, but I was so captivated by this idea of creation. And I started noticing how it showed up in my day-to-day life, or how I am now aware of it.
Yeah.
And so I kind of lost sight of the second and also the anti type.
That's totally fine. So say more about where you see it sort of now that you've got that whatever lens on, what do you see?
Yeah. When I look back at the activities that I do and part of my daily life, it's always around, for lack of a better word, making something new. Making something new. As I talk about in my intro, I'm a professor by day. And so let's just take that as an example, right? So when I'm doing that, I used to focus mostly on teaching. I would tell people, I love teaching. I'm passionate about teaching, passionate. But now that I'm aware of this part of me that loves to create, I realize, oh yeah, that's right. I do love putting a good syllabus together. or creating a course, because there's nothing. Take a textbook and voila, turn it into a course. That's all a part of the creation process. And I realized how much I really enjoy that part of it.
Yeah.
I knew it, but it just became more conscious, and it's been front and center since I read this book.
Yeah. Do you feel like if you do not get to the point where the thing actually appears in the world, it's very frustrating? Like it has to have the end point is always that something tangible has to come out of it?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Not necessarily. Now let me think about that more carefully. I like when you could see something, or like in our case for this episode, it's an experience. You can't see it, right? I feel like we've created an experience already. And so it doesn't have to have a tangible, but for me, it has to have an end point, a beginning and an end. That's the thing. It could be physical or non-physical, but there's a beginning and an end. And that was the thing I made.
Yeah. So
that works for me.
Well, and the reason I ask, right, is because just in terms of personality, right? And this is why some, these sparketypes are like heuristics, right? Like they reveal things to you that, right? And I think my feeling is that one of the things that's really productive about you and I working together is I could think about things forever, like literally, right? Like it's okay with me. Just like, right? Like, oh, and like, I could think about this podcast and this conversation for years before we actually had it. Like we would all be dust by the time I would actually have to like record it. Right. But yes, my instinct suggests that you're like, okay, that's it. Like, great, we're going to do it. Then let's just do it. Right. Let the thing occur, as opposed to, really just wrapping our brains around it multiple times.
Yes. Because once we had the date set, it was done in my mind.
For example. So yeah, that's, it's interesting to me in that way, right? It reveals those kinds of tensions, but also possibilities, right? If you know, like for me, if I know that my tendency is to just continue to think and like, go over here and do this piece of it, go over here and do this piece of it, but I'm not necessarily driven to have an endpoint, right? Then it might be the case that I am more productive at getting things out into the world if I hook myself to somebody who's a maker, who that's your calling, right? This is all great, but at the end of the day, we're going to finish this thing. So it does suggest some kind of interesting opportunities, I guess.
Yes. And as I listen to you talk about how, it helps us see ourselves respectively and collectively, I think about people who are working in teams, how it could be beneficial in that way, employee interactions, just all these ideas are coming to me now. Family, friendships. Yeah. And by the way, we're not advertising the book necessarily for any reason other than this is our true experience. So I don't have any affiliation or affiliate with this. It's just, it works for us. And we're talking about the ways in which it works for us.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I have, because I have a secret structure in my head, I have some questions about, I think it's productive in lots of ways. I also have some questions about where it might have some blind spots, right? Or it might be better buttressed with other kinds of things as well.
So let's hear some of those.
Oh, well, okay. So for instance, and he might talk about this, but like in a section I didn't read, right? Because I think he really suggests that you don't just read the whole book all at a time. Like you go with the ones that are most relevant to you, and then you might unpack a little. But so my anti-spark type, for the record, because I really did just like take this very right, like I did this in a very organized way, is the performer. And on the one hand, it took me a minute because I'm like, no, like I'm recording this podcast, right? Like I give talks, I do whatever, and it's fine. But it gets back to your point about the energy, right?
Yeah.
I will do it, and I actually kind of enjoy it. And then when it's done, it's like I have to lay down on the floor. Like
Yes.
that was all I had. I gave it what I had, and like now I need some time to recharge it.
Yeah.
As opposed to people who do it and just feel like lit up and they're super excited by it, right? And it feeds them. But my question, and I'm wondering if you have some insight into this, is, I think the performer one sticks out to me because in part, right, part of the thing I think that is in that is really enjoying being the center of attention, right? You want people to look at you. You want people to pay attention. And growing up in an Asian American household, that is pretty discouraged. I know that there are Asian American performers of the world, right? Like God knows I love me some Sandra Oh. But I wonder to what extent those people would have to step over a kind of cultural tendency, right? Not to really, to not stick out. And so I guess my question is, do you think that there are ways that sort of different kinds of identities, whether those be right, race and ethnicity, whether those be social class, whether those be ability, all of those different age, all of those different things, if those are sort of playing a role in these categories that he set up, and that, that's
my short answer is absolutely yes.
Okay.
That's the short answer because, we're multidimensional people, right? And I'm sure he's doing a good job with the information that you have at hand. But we are so complex as human beings, so complex, and we're so multidimensional, right? So I don't know why it escaped me what my anti was, but I kind of think it was performer too.
Really?
Yes.
Interesting. Okay.
Right, because it sounds like, and this is a question for clarification for you, it sounds like performing, I know you said it's kind of about the cultural conditioning of sorts, but do you enjoy it is my question.
I think if we're using his categories, right, which have some like deep resonance in situations where I feel like it feeds something bigger, right? Or where my job is to use language to put things into order for people, right? Which is what a lot of inspirational talks are about, right? Or like that kind of thing. Or I'm going to organize this conversation so people can listen to it and learn about teaching, like blah, blah, blah. So when any kind of performance serves those other things, yeah, I do. I'm like, okay, I'm going to get this in order, right? Like I'm going to figure out what the questions are that are going to reveal these things to people. But if it's like, get up in a crowd of people and like, I don't know, recite a poem, like, no, absolutely not. Stand up and like speak extemporaneously about this. No, thank you. Like, thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah. I think it illustrates how, like I was just saying, how we're, complex. As performer, for me, it is draining after I do it, but I enjoy it. For the same reasons you talked about. If I feel like and I'm all about meaning and purpose, if it's connected to a broader meaning and purpose, I enjoy it. But I have exhausted at the end of it. Teaching, always exhausted afterwards.
Yeah.
But had a great time. Loved it. It was a blast.
Over.
Yeah. Now I need a nap, so to speak, right? So.
Yeah. And I think that's a really useful point, right? And it's a useful differentiator because it's not all of these things are off the table for you, right? You hate all of them, you're terrible at them, whatever. It seems to be more about that sort of energy add or energy drain.
Yes.
Kind of.
It comes down to energy.
Yep. I'm also surprised by that because I feel like, people so enjoy having you take those roles, right? Whether it's at church or giving a talk or all of these kinds of things. And it seems like you're often very amenable to those invitations, but I can also see when it's like, okay, like that's it, I'm done. Like,
yeah. I enjoy them for the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are two different aspects, right?
Yep.
It's okay to enjoy it and it just happens to drain me.
Yep.
So that's not the thing I do all the time.
Yep.
Yeah.
So here's another question. For the record, I'm a little out to sea because like these are not linearly focused, right? I was thinking about another book that you are very familiar with, Gay Hendricks, The Big Leap. Is that what it's
The
called?
Big Leap. Yep.
And, he has that idea, right, of like remind me, it's the zone of genius versus the
zone of excellence, zone of competence, and zone of incompetence. The 4 zones, which are, he says, we have activities that fall in those zones within those categories.
Okay.
A set of activities, not just one, but a set of activities that fall in those particular categories that he calls zones.
Okay. So, I got it. That's also useful because I did not get that specific, the idea that you can have activities that fall as opposed to you are in these, right? But rather you can be doing these in your zone of genius and over here, you're right, your zone of competence. But I think I always come back to his idea that you can get kind of stuck, right? Particularly when you are good at something that you get positive reinforcement for, but that actually distracts you, right, from sort of getting into the thing that actually is the place where you excel and you feel charged in those kinds of things. And so I was wondering if, because you know that book so much better than I do, if there's a kind of overlap or there's a way in which some of Hendrix's ideas sort of float into this Sparketype book or vice versa. Like it feels to me like there's some interesting connection there, but I can't quite get my hand wrapped around it.
Yeah, I would think they're similar, the zone of genius activities. But again, the difference is sort of personality type almost and activity kind of focused. But I think the zone of genius is close. I would say they're cousins.
Nice.
I think they're cousins. Yeah.
Make like a little family tree.
Yeah. Yeah.
Doing this work.
They're related, but they're not quite in the same family.
Yeah.
And I think this focus on energy is completely different and it adds a little more to the conversation.
Yeah, I agree. Do you remember in this Fields book, I think like for each of these archetypes that he has, I'm sorry, I'm having a really hard time saying that word because I just want it to be archetype. I get that it's his word for things and he's coining the phrase, but it just feels a little hokey to me. Okay. Sorry, Jonathan Fields. If you ever hear that, that's just my linguistic bias. So, but when he lays it out, right, it's sort of, he gives you this is your calling. This is what's energy rich for you. Here are some stories about different kinds of people who also fit the same sort of model that you do. And then he has these, I think the section is called something like where you get tripped up or something like these, here are the things to be cautious of because people who are like you have a tendency to fall into these traps. Do you remember what they are for makers?
I know the language that he uses is quirks, right? Is that what you're talking about? He calls them the quirks.
Sure.
So anyway, yeah, I don't know that I remember specifically. I kind of, and even all of his, I didn't match up, like I guess is true with anybody, which is why I say we're all multidimensional. I didn't match up exactly with any of them, like directly. Yeah. However, I saw senses like parts of, that's kind of like me. So my response was like, yeah, that's kind of like me. Mm-hmm. But yeah, offhand, I don't remember what the quirks were, but I could look them up right now because I have the book right in front of me. But meanwhile, all right, did you? I
feel like it's nice in some ways, again, both because things are resonant and because maybe I need things articulated back to me in very clear language in order to see them clearly in the same way that when he says, here are some qualities, right? You're like, oh, all of a sudden I see them reflected in my life in ways that I might not have before, but so for this scientist thing, right? One of the things he says about, what might trip you up is, for instance, it's just on the page, it just says certainty. And I'm like, oh shoot. I just feel nabbed. I feel like somebody's he's just basically pointing right in my face. I'm like, yes.
You, Kim, it's you.
Your problem is certainty. Yes, that is correct. It's but I'm sure I'm right. Right. Because I've thought about this problem a lot. So I'm just, clearly I am correct about this, right? How could it be any different? So I'm, and then he goes on, right? Another one is lack of control. Yes. Thank you. Fine. These sorts of things. And so those to me feel resonant, but I was just wondering if that is true for other, for others of these categories.
Well, for mine in the maker category, he says the first one, boredom with systems and scale. No offense, Kim. No offense to your scientist sensibilities.
Oh, that's right. That's why we build teams. But yes.
Exactly. I think it could be a good thing. And it's this idea of what I mentioned before. I need an endpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And so I could be on with the next. Systems and scales tend to be ongoing. Right? This idea, which is the point, right? You need it for ongoing. So it makes sense that that one would resonate with me. Yeah, I'm done. But what's the next thing?
We just make this thing, get it off my plate, and like go on.
Let's move on.
Yeah. No, it makes it. Yes. And like, how much do I love a system? I love a good system. Like,
yes.
Warms the cockles of my heart. It's really. Mm-hmm.
And I love that there are people like you who can do that and think about it, because my tolerance is so low for it. Right. So I need that. Right. I was like, oh yeah, I need that because I'm like ready to go.
Well, and likewise, right? Like it's, it's like, do this thing. And I'm like, wait, I have to think about it first. Like, just give me like 3 days, like just to consider it, to turn it around, to imagine that what you're asking me to do is actually the right thing that you're asking me to do, like, et cetera, right? Which I think for anybody who just wants to move forward, it's just like, why do you have to make it so complicated? I am curious though, like, have you thought at all about where this maker personality fits in academia? Because maybe this is personal, but I often think it has a tendency to like love people like me who just want to think, don't want to do anything. I'm not don't want to do anything, but I want to think about things to the nth degree for as long as it takes, who really want to put systems in place, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess part A, 1A of that question is that assessment correct? And part B is, if it's true, then what does it mean, or how does it feel to be a maker in a sea of scientists?
Yes, I am. Let's just take the semester structure, for example. This is a prime example of it.
Yeah.
Some universities are on quarter systems, but mine is on semester. So there's 16 weeks. Mm-hmm. Even as a student, and even now teaching, 16 weeks, way too long. 8 weeks, which is normally around the midterm exam, I'm usually done. As a student, I was done. And as a professor, I'm done. So I structure my courses as if they're in separate courses within the 16 weeks. So there's a beginning and end of one segment, and the beginning. Actually, there's 3 because, 16 weeks is a long time. So I'm usually doing a switch quite often to make it a beginning and end within that structure.
Mm-hmm. So I would just
that's an example.
Yeah, no, it's a great example because I think that what people are learning about student retention, whether you're adult learners or sort of, quote unquote, traditional college students, et cetera, is that I think of it as a system. The structure that you're creating is actually much more amenable to people finishing and to their learning, right? So in some ways, as much as it breaks my heart, the 16-week semester is an old structure that we maintain through institutions, but is not a perfect match for the majority of people who are stuck in it, right? So you've actually you've made this thing inside this old structure that serves you, but I think it's also probably serving your students.
Yes.
Much more.
Because as I remember as a student, even in grad school, I felt like, I got it. I understand. Do we need to know any more? I just felt like I have a good understanding of the topic. I mean, it wasn't even so much. I really felt like, what more else could there be? Like, are we talking more about the same? Or I didn't know it in the beginning. Now I know it. So yeah, that's just an example.
But I'm all, like, again, I find this really curious, right? Because you're clearly somebody who has succeeded in the academic domain, despite a personality tendency that is really frustrated by these structures, right? So I'd be curious to hear more about like, whether, is that just about like brute persistence on your part? Is that about, right, somehow reimagining again, like how you make things within it? Is it like, what's the strategy or the compensation that allows you to seemingly, right, go against what is maybe a more fundamental part of your nature?
That's a great question. That's a great question because it brings us back to leadership purpose.
Excellent. I wasn't even trying, but we ended up there. That's my whole goal in the podcast. We're done. Hit it.
It brings us back to leadership purpose.
Yeah.
I would say, I don't know how long, but sometime over the past 20 years, I developed a strategy to live in a way that is fulfilling to me, right? Was putting it together. And so I talk to my guests about what they think about what leadership purpose is, but I don't often talk about what I think it is. Yeah. And so for me, leadership purpose is just how you express your purpose through your work. Mm-hmm. And whether you are in a official leadership role or unofficial leadership role, that's what I'm calling leadership purpose. Mm-hmm. And leadership purpose, in my understanding of it, comes from who you are as a person and bringing out the best of who you are through your work. Mm-hmm. And so we hear people say all the time, yeah, the best of who I am. What does that mean? Right. And so this is what it means for me. And I've been saying this in many different ways over the past 2 years. But it's when you get at the best of who you are, when you're looking at your passions, those things that you love, right? Which I include, and he talks about energy. Mm-hmm. Energy comes when you're passionate, it has a certain energy. So I combine those. So passion, values, something about it has to be important, really matter. Your natural abilities, those things that come easily, naturally, you're good at. Those three things in combination with something that is serving, is something you're doing something beyond yourself. Yeah. So that has been my guide. You said, how do you manage basically in the world, in life, in work? Yeah. I try to make sure all those things are in operation at once. And when they are, it doesn't matter so much about the circumstances necessarily if I can create it wherever I am. In some cases, I might have to change circumstances, but within a job, like what we were just talking about, I created something that would work for me within that 16-week semester.
Correct. Yes. Okay. So many different things. Honestly, sometimes I have this image of just like my brain becomes like the meeting place of like 17 trains, all like, and they're all just stuck and like nothing can come out because all the trains want to go first. So let me try to put them in order. I think at the end of the day, right, the reason why I was like, when you're bored, can you read this book and tell me what you think, is because I think Fields tucks purpose in underneath, right? It is one of these all of the different sort of categories that he's looking at, right? And I think for you, it's the lead, right? It's the most important one. And these other things serve purpose. And for him, it's one among many. And so my instinct was kind of like, oh, I'm curious to see where these two models collide, right? And in some ways, I feel like if your earlier metaphor about Gay Hendricks was, oh, this book and Gay Hendricks' book are kind of like cousins, because I think they're mapping similar territory, but in different ways. And my intuition, although I can't work it out perfectly on the fly, is that you two have places where your ideas might inform each other, right? But that is this fundamental difference in terms of how you configure, right? And what you would prioritize amongst all of these things that are really important. And I quite like that. I mean, I think it to me, for your listeners or anybody else who's like sort of familiar with your work and then looking at this book, they would have to really take into account, right? Is it about, do I get a blueprint of who I am and then make decisions about my life on the basis of this blueprint? Or is it the model that you've talked about, right? Which is you get centered in your purpose first, and then that gives you all these tools to kind of either withstand or shift and change your circumstances around, so one is really yours is a model that's about
decision-making based on purpose.
An agency.
Yes.
right? This is a model where you make choices and you do things and you have the ability to pull levers and shift things around. I don't want to, I don't want to dumb down his book. I think he's a complicated thinker, but it does sort of seem to suggest like, once you know who you are, then you use that to sort of like decide, or you use that to move forward. But it's a little more constraining, right? It's a blueprint. It's as opposed to sorry, I have to mime it, so that's probably not helping on the audio, but like this model of like what and how you move in the world versus who you are will determine whether or not you've landed in a place that you're happy.
Yes.
Right?
It informs your decisions and how you move. Yeah.
Nice. Yes. Thank you. Much more concise. Get it. Make it work. If I just put more language around it, maybe that'll fix it. Yeah. So it's a curious, sort of fault line, I think, in between sort of what you provide to people, what this book is providing to people.
Yeah. So as we think about kind of coming to a close to this conversation that I'm enjoying so much, what would you say in terms of any final thoughts, thinking, questions to me? I'll stall for a moment to give you some time, a couple seconds to strategize your system of your response.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm just gonna, right. Like I do not have the capacity to like wrap it up on a dime. I will say that differentiator was what I was trying to get at, I think, when I had asked you, right? And again, I don't want to dismiss, I certainly do not want to dismiss his work as being limited or limiting. But I do think it is worth marking how that is. I think one will tell you more about, his book is designed to tell you a lot about yourself, which is, as we've said, right? When it resonates deeply. It reveals things to you about where your energy is, what you're good at, like all of those kinds of things. I don't know if it quite prepares you to move forward in challenging circumstances in the way that I think a lot of, your sort of suggestions and leadership and understanding does, Robin. So I'd have to think more about that, but I think that differentiation was the whole purpose behind me sending you like can you take this when you're bored email to begin with.
So there you go. I took it, read the book, the main parts when we had the conversation. And now for everybody who's listening, you get the opportunity to take the assessment, take the quiz and see where you stand. Because a lot of times, oftentimes in this podcast, I say again now today, the podcast is for high achieving women who are, you're doing all the things, you're supporting everyone else. And I think having this conversation just between friends, but also the book is a form of inspiration and support and information.
Totally.
When you're the one who is, taking care of everything, supporting everyone else, the responsible one, and you don't have a moment, just one more indicator or one more a tool of information about yourself. Although it might not do completely, to your point, Kim, it might not do everything that you feel like it could do, but it gives you enough information to help you in the midst of all that. And so that's the hope.
Yeah. And actually, as you say that, two things occur to me. One, if I have read this book, I am guaranteed somebody out there loves this book and is just like, what is wrong with you? It is so clear that this book does X, Y, and Z. So please, it's going to be, please tell Rob. Somebody tell me that I'm wrong. First of all, you can write me too and tell me that I'm wrong. I would appreciate being, being corrected. But the piece we didn't get to, nor do we have to, but that might be interesting follow-up work for people listening. I think there is some really interesting suggestions here that we kind of touched on about team building, right? Or exactly as you say, that your listeners who are these high achieving women who do it all themselves. Mm-hmm. So they might recognize themselves in a particular spark type and get some really good ideas about, who they need to reach out to, to do these things that drain them, but who would love the opportunity to contribute to their larger kind of meaning and purpose in that way. I think that to me is one of the big sort of offerings of this book is think differently about how you put teams together for sure.
Yeah, that's a great nugget to end on. So tell us the title and author of the book again before we end.
She says as she opens the book. Okay, so right, it is called Sparked. Discover your unique imprint for work that makes you come alive. That is a great title. The author is Jonathan Fields. I believe he works he's worked with individuals for a long time, but I think he also works with companies. So if there are people who are really into this work, they should look it up.
Okay, great. And I'll put it in the show notes. And thank you, Kim. And for everybody else, Dr. Kim Middleton, my friend, if you want to contact her and hear more about her, you can go back to our episode 35, or is there somewhere else they can be in touch with you?
Yeah, no, I think we did a lot of information in that one. So let's just leave it with that. Go back to episode 35. Check out the show notes.
All right, episode 35. And if you want to contact me, you can go to my website, robinlowens.com, robinlowens.com. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Leadership Purpose with Dr. Robin podcast. If you enjoyed it, head on over and rate and subscribe so you never miss an episode. New episodes drop every week, and I can't wait to hang out with you again soon. Meanwhile, this is Dr. Robin signing off. See you next time.